Hello everyone. Our presentation today is titled The Dynamics of Conflict. And the emphasis here, or the point we're trying to make in this presentation, is trying to find out what are the various complexities, or the various dynamics, basically of conflict. I'm looking for other synonyms of dynamics, but dynamics of conflict, basically, that's what we're talking about today. And Mayer has argued that every individual, has two perspectives on conflict. The first one is the fact that conflict is a natural process, it's inevitable, it's necessary, it's normal. So not necessarily the fact that conflict exists, but resolving it, is where the various contradictions come in. So everyone believes that conflict is a normal, natural process in human interaction. That's one perspective. The other perspective, which of course is interesting, is the fact that people are always reluctant to admit that they are that they exist within a conflict society or a conflictual society. So while people argue that conflict is natural, everyone, human interaction is laden with conflict, and as people interact, conflict is almost inevitable. All right, they also do not want to accept that they themselves live within that conflictual society, which is more or less a contradiction. But that's what Mayer argues, and there seems to be a lot of sense in that argument. All right, it appears also that admitting that conflict exists, or that we are within a conflict environment, is more or less like admitting a feeling of hopelessness or failure, you know, which should not necessarily be the case. So when we admit that we are in conflict, or that conflict exists around us, or that we live within a conflictual environment, it doesn't mean that we have failed, or that we should be hopeless. That should not be the natural outcome. All right, and of course we see various instances of that reflected in interactions, whether at home or in the workplace or wherever. You know, if you find two parents who are engaging in a very, very intense argument, and they tell their children, oh, that they're just having a discussion, they don't want to acknowledge that they are in conflict, and so they just wave it off as a discussion. And in fact, in the corporate world, corporate organizations are very, very eager to call trainers, corporate trainers, organizations, firms, to train them on efficiency, perhaps, or accountability, or some other area. But they are always shy to call conflict resolution experts to talk to them about conflict and how to manage them. And in fact, when they're in conflict, to help them resolve such conflicts. So there seems to be a contradiction, in relations to conflict and how it is perceived in the human community, which is not very healthy. All right. Now, individual perspectives of conflict determine to a large extent, how conflict will be managed. So if people see conflict as a failure, then it is obvious that they will most naturally shy away from resolving such conflict. If they see conflict as a necessary part of life, they'll be more eager to resolve such conflict. So perspective matters in terms of conflict resolution, and of course perspective also not about the nature, the conflict itself, but the nature of the conflict, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So all of that matters. The assumptions we have, about the nature of conflict also, you know, impacts on how disposed we are to resolving or managing such conflicts. Okay, in order to improve our response and management of conflict, our assumptions about conflict need to be challenged. All right, our assumptions about conflict need to be challenged, because sometimes we feel that we have the right assumptions about conflict, but when we are exposed to other assumptions, to other information about conflict, we are marveled, because we see that our assumptions were not really even very watertight. So it's important to challenge assumptions, because that will better help us understand conflict, and of course will help us effectively and more efficiently address them. All right. There are three-dimensional perspectives, or there's a three-dimensional perspective in understanding the complexity and dynamics of conflict. So in trying to understand how complex conflict is, there are three dimensions to look at conflict complexity or dynamics from. One of such is conflict as perception. All right. And here we're saying that when you're looking at conflict as a perception, it means that conflict is a belief, understanding that one's need, an individual's need and interests or perspectives are incompatible with someone else's. So an individual sees conflict as perception when they perceive that their needs, their perception, or their perspectives, their ideals, their ideologies in life, their wants, interests are incompatible with those of others. That is what we mean by conflict as perception. All right. So the mere fact that individual thinks or feels, basically thinks that they have incompatible perspectives, or goals, interests, needs with other individuals, means that there's a conflict already occurring. That's one perception of conflict. That's one dimension of conflict in dealing with the dynamics of conflict. So in trying to understand conflict dynamics, it's important to, first of all, understand conflict as perception. The fact that individuals basically just thinking about the fact that their perspectives, their needs, their wants, their values are incompatible with others is a conflict already on its own. All right. And conflict exists here just basically based on the fact that one person believes it exists. So an individual can be in conflict with somebody else without the other person even knowing that a conflict is going on. All right. Simply because such individual feels or thinks that they have incompatible perspectives with the other party. All right. That is one. That's one dimension. The other dimension is conflict as feeling. All right. And such feeling could be feelings of fear, of sadness, bitterness, anger, and so on and so forth. So basically, conflict as feeling is described as conflict, that is based on emotional reaction to a situation. When someone reacts emotionally to a situation, it means that conflict has occurred. That's another dimension to look at conflict from. So not only from the perception dimension, there's also the feelings dimension. All right, where individuals have emotional reactions to certain situations or to certain individual, that signals some kind of disagreement. All right, and I've mentioned that such feelings, such emotional reactions could be fear. All right, you try to scare someone, or you make someone angry. Someone becomes angry at you for something that you did, which you didn't intend to anger the person by. All right, so these feelings that one person has can be the beginning of conflict, which of course the other party doesn't know. So in fact, it is said that in conflict it doesn't take two to tango. There's this popular maxim that it takes two to tango, but that doesn't seem to be the case in conflict, because someone can be in conflict with you, without you even knowing that a conflict exists between you and such a person. All right, so these are two dimensions. The third dimension is conflict as action. All right, and here it says that this is conflict in regards to the actions that we take to express our feelings, to articulate our perceptions, or to get our needs met. All right, and we take these actions in such a way that they undermine or they interfere with someone else's ability to get their own needs met. So in trying to promote our perception, in trying to express our feelings, in trying to meet our needs, there are certain actions that we engage in. All right, by way of engaging in those actions in such a way that they interfere with the needs, with the ability of other people to meet their needs, it means that conflict, is going on. So these are three dimensions, of the dynamics of conflict. All right, these are three dimensions of conflict dynamics. So when you're thinking about conflict, you shouldn't think about conflict only as action. Somebody did something, and because that thing interferes with my ability to meet my needs, it means that a conflict has occurred. That's just one of the dimensions. There's also a feeling. There's also conflict as feeling. There's also conflict as perception. All right, so these are three separate dimensions, that are involved in the conflict dynamics. And for us to properly understand the dynamics of conflict, we must understand these three dimensions of conflict as well. All right. Now, the nature of conflict in one of these dimensions, of course, affects the nature of conflict in another dimension. And what we mean is that if, for instance, someone has a feeling of sadness, all right, such feeling of sadness can lead to the person acting in such a way that it interferes with somebody else's ability to meet their needs. So we're talking about conflict as a feeling now. Someone has a feeling of fear, and we said that such a feeling can also be interpreted as conflict, right? So if someone has a feeling of fear, the fear the person has can lead to certain actions that will interfere with the ability of others to meet their own needs. So we're saying that the nature of conflict in one dimension that we have mentioned, one of the three dimensions we have mentioned, can also affect the nature of conflict in another dimension. So conflict as feeling can affect conflict as perception, can affect conflict as action. All right. So it's not as if these conflicts are just static or monolithic. They can affect one another. Okay. And individuals can also go through all these three stages, all these three dimensions. The same individual can have a conflict of perception. The same individual can have a conflict as emotion. The same individual can have conflict as action. So individuals do not exist in only one of these dimensions all the time. They can move through all three stages, in fact, at the same time. So there's really no static or stagnant rule, right? In regards to these three dimensions that have been mentioned, they can unfold in individuals at the same time or at separate times, and of course, they can also affect one another. Okay. When individuals or groups are in conflict, they are dealing with different or sometimes contradictory dimensions, in these different dynamics, rather, in these different dimensions, and they believe or they behave and act and react accordingly. All right. So basically, what we're saying is that individuals can move through these three dimensions equally at the same time, at separate times, and of course, their action in one dimension can affect their action in another dimension. All right. So what you need to understand here is that these three dimensions we have mentioned, conflict as perception, conflict as feeling, conflict as action, are not straight jacketed. They can implicate one another. They can affect one another, and individuals can, of course, be caught in all three dimensions, either at the same time or at separate times. Now, the framework for conflict, for the causes of conflict, we have talked about in the past, we have talked about some of the theories that help to explain the causes of conflict. But you find out that those theories do not do justice, in the sense that those theories are not very practical in providing us with practical causes or factors that can motivate conflict. All right. So here it is important for us to come up with more practical framework, of factors that are able to motivate conflict or cause conflict or create conflict situations. All right. We're also told that human needs are at the center of all conflict. So every conflict that you see occurring, at the center of it is a human need. All right. And what that need is can vary. The needs can vary depending on the conflict in question. But we have highlighted 5 factors that capture the concerns for human needs, that capture various human needs or various needs that can lead to conflict. And these 5 factors constitute the framework for understanding more practically the causes of conflict. All right, we'll talk about them one after the other. The first one is communication. Communication is a human need. All right, and we're told that individuals can hardly engage in perfect communication. There's hardly any individual that communicates perfectly. And imperfect communications that we have are one major cause of conflict. All right? The imperfect communications we have are a major cause of conflict. Of course, in certain cases, we communicate imperfectly, and we such communications appear to others as being incompatible with their interests, with their goals, and of course they can lead to conflict. So imperfect communications not just only create conflict, but they even make conflict harder to resolve. Imperfect communications also make conflict harder to resolve. It's difficult for individuals to communicate about complex concerns, especially under certain circumstances. So already we have noted that communications are not perfect, and there are certain circumstances that even further complicate the way we communicate. All right. So you might communicate better in a particular circumstance, and when other circumstances arise, it is more difficult for us to communicate effectively. Okay. So communication is one human need that is very, very complex or complicated. All right. And can be one of the causes of conflict. All right. It says conflict largely occurs because people assume that they have communicated accurately, when in actual fact they have not. There are certain times we feel that we have passed the message adequately, but in actual sense, we have not really communicated. Okay, there are other things that also challenge our ability to communicate effectively: culture, gender, age, environment. There are certain people you want to talk to. You might want to talk to a certain group of individuals, and then you begin to talk as a young person. You're talking to an elderly group of individuals, and there are certain things you say. There are certain mannerisms, like you might use as in, you might use you might use all of those youthful mannerisms that we use when we talk, you guys, and then the audience feels insulted, the audience feels slighted. In such a communication, the age of the audience you're communicating to has created a cause of, has created a conflict. And some people, might take offense seriously with you calling them you guys. Okay. So this is just an example of how imperfect communications can lead to conflict. All right. As one of the factors within the practical framework of the causes of conflict. The other factor is emotions. Of course, we're told that emotions often control behavior. Most times our behavior is controlled by our emotions. Sometimes emotions also contribute to the energy and the strength, that people participate in conflict, or that with which people participate in conflict. So if people are seriously emotionally involved in a conflict, they can appear more bitter. The conflict can become more intense. More violent weapons can be used, or more deadly weapons can be used. The casualties can be more. All of that can be a result of the emotion, the passion with which people engage in conflict. All right. So emotions have a way of fueling conflict, basically. And individuals can be rational. If individuals can be rational and focused on how to meet their needs, then of course conflict may never arise. But how rational can individuals be? That's the question. There are certain times we make irrational choices, irrational behaviors, and eventually conflict occurs. So individuals do not have the ability to be rational all the time. There are times we allow emotions to take over, and those emotions can either result in conflict, or they can either help to also manage conflict, resolve conflict. So emotions do not just cause conflict, but emotions can also help manage conflict. You know, um, an example is given there when someone expresses a genuine feeling of sadness. You know, that genuine expression of a sad feeling calls for some dialogue that can help to resolve such a conflict. All right. So emotions that are genuinely expressed can also help provide timely solutions to conflict. Okay. All men have a desire to seek connection, to seek affirmation and acceptance. All right. And emotions can prevent, can moderate, or control conflict behavior. So emotions can be a double-edged sword. It can help to cause conflict or intensify, escalate conflict, and make the casualties, more in number. At the same time, emotions can also help to control, prevent or manage conflict to a very large extent. The third factor are values. Of course, values are said to be tied with identity. You know, we are identified by our values, or our values identify us most in most cases. And so, when we talk about values, we're talking about those identifying beliefs, those identifying characteristics that people hold on to very dearly. All right, values are individual beliefs about what is important, what is right and wrong, good and evil, and the principles that should govern life generally. So when these values are attacked, you know, people feel attacked. People feel that their personality, their identity is being attacked. All right. And so most times people find it very difficult to compromise these values. Somebody who feels that gay marriage, for instance, is very wrong, and then you tell the person to marry off her son to a man. It's difficult for such a person to compromise that value because that is the person's identity, you know. And so such attack on values could also cause conflict, could cause conflict. Since conflicts that result from human needs around values are more dangerous and difficult to contain, the reason is because such values are tied with the individual's identity. And so individuals want to protect their identity, their integrity, with all that they have. And so such values are very, 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 very intense. All right. Structure is another factor. Structure, the structure within which a conflict occurs. It says the environment within which human interactions take place can also be a source of conflict. All right. Even when individuals agree to cooperate, the structure within which they exist, can cause conflict. All right. Of course, when two people exist in a room, as roommates, the mere fact that they are within that space is a potential for conflict, because sometimes there are certain interactions that might go on that will lead to conflict if they were not, as opposed to if they were not within that space. So for instance, if those people were not inside, if they were not roommates, it's most likely that they will not be in conflict. But the mere fact of the environment within which they are existing and interacting, is a factor that can lead to conflict if not properly managed. All right. We're told that other structural elements that can lead to conflict are the closeness of the parties involved, distribution of resources, access to information, pressures here and there, and all of this. So these are other issues that can further complicate structure as a cause of conflict. All right, and further complicate structure as a cause of conflict. So we're looking basically at the more practical causes of conflict. We have talked about communication and how imperfect communication, helps to bring about conflict. We have talked about values, and how values can complicate conflict. We've talked about structure. All right. We talked about one other thing. We talked about emotions as well. Yeah, emotions. And how emotions can also fuel conflict or help to manage conflict considerably. All right. And the last one is history. So conflicts cannot be understood in isolation of their history. They cannot be isolated from their historical roots, as the slide says, because the history about the conflict, the history of the parties involved in the conflict, all of that history provides relevant information as to why the conflict started in the first place, how the conflict can be effectively managed, or even why the conflict has lasted as long as it has. All right. So history of the conflicting parties, the environment within which the conflict occurs, the history of the issues themselves are significant in determining the cause of the conflict. The cause now, not the direction, but the reason why the conflict occurs. That's a typographical error there. The cause of the conflict. Okay, so history can act as a motivation for developing of conflict as well. When people have a very, very dark history, or a very, very uncomfortable history, it is very likely that such individuals will be more prone to be in conflict than people who do not have a similar history. So history is very important and can be a major cause of conflict as well. All right. So these are five factors that constitute practical frameworks that help us identify the causes of conflict: communication, emotions, values, structure, and then history. All right. Now, why do we need to talk about dynamics of conflict? Why is it important to understand the dynamics of conflict? Because it helps us understand human behavior. Understanding conflict dimensions, or dynamics rather, helps us understand conflict, helps us understand human behavior. All right. Remember, we said at the beginning that individuals, on one hand, feel that conflict is necessary, is inevitable, but on the other hand, they also fail to accept that they live within a conflict environment. So we can better understand human behavior when we understand the dynamics of conflict. And of course, conflict also is not an entirely bad enterprise. We have said that conflict can be also, can have good results, good outcomes. It can help us build pathways to growth and development for individuals, families, communities. It helps us to build communities, to define and balance human needs. All right. Conflict also helps us to identify individual faces and address, the many difficulties regarding choices that life brings to us. Conflict process can be important for bonding, for growth producing experiences. All right. And of course, effective conflict management reveal that social organizations can adapt to change, within the environment that they exist. So conflict has some positive benefits, which we have highlighted in this slide. All right. So it's important for us to understand the dynamics of conflict, because it helps us understand human behavior, and it also has positive benefits for community, for individuals, for organizations, and for the environment at large. Now, we have said in conclusion that effective conflict management is possible. Not all conflicts might be resolved completely, but conflicts can be managed so much so that they have positive outcomes, they have positive impacts on individuals and on society as a whole. All right. I've also said that conflict is inevitable, is constructive, and of course we must accept. Acceptance of conflict is one way of managing such conflicts effectively. So once we deny the existence of conflict, or once we see conflict once we see accepting conflict as failure or as a feeling of hopelessness, then it's more difficult for us to manage and resolve such conflict. So acceptance is very, very important. We have said that the dynamics of conflict, are three-dimensional. There are three dimensions of conflict dynamics. We've talked about conflict as perception. We've talked about conflict as as emotion. We've talked about conflict as action, as conflict as feeling rather. So conflict as perception, conflict as feeling, and then conflict as action. These are three dimensions in the dynamics of conflict. And we've talked about how individuals can be in all three dimensions at the same time, and how the nature of one dimension can affect, the other dimension. And we have also said that our success as individuals, communities, organizations, societies depend on how well we are able to understand conflict dynamics. All right? So, conflict dynamics is important, and it is something that we must all understand because it helps us better resolve conflict, better understand human behavior, and to identify in the areas in which conflict can be more useful in human interaction. We're going to have to end the presentation at this point. I hope that this has been helpful. If you have questions or comments, especially regarding the frameworks or regarding the dimensions of conflict dynamics, all right, you can raise those questions and then we can continue the conversation afterwards. Thank you so much for your time.